Hello, Jim, and thank you for emailing us your question about Ishii and California Indian tobacco use. I'm Ralph Gibson, Museums Administrator for the Placer County Museums, and before I answer Jim's question, I first have to briefly explain who Ishii was. Ishii was a member of the Yagi band of Yana Indians in Northern California around Shasta and Tehama counties. And although he was born in 1861, he continued the cultural traditions and life ways of his ancestors. By 1911, he was the last living member of his tribe. He was all alone, he was starving, and he crept into a rancher's corral foraging for food, and he was captured. He was a man of two worlds, prehistoric and modern. And very quickly, he caught the attention of a UC Berkeley anthropologist, Dr. Alfred Kroeber. Dr. Kroeber invited Ishii to the campus, and there he was studied and given a job as a janitor, a job he held until his death in 1916. And according to the National Park Service, his friends at the museum buried him in the traditional Yagi way by cremating him along with one of his bows, 5 arrows, a basket of acorn meal, a box full of shell bead money, a purse full of tobacco, 3 rings, and some obsidian flakes. Ishii's remains are at Mount Olivet Cemetery near San Francisco. What drew Jim's attention was the tobacco, because most people believed that tobacco use was relegated primarily to those tribes that were living in what is now the American Southwest, South, and Southeastern part of what's now the United States. But that's not necessarily true. We're talking about 2 different types of tobacco here: wild tobacco and domesticated tobacco. Tobacco was first domesticated near the Andes Mountains about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, and via trade found its way north into Mexico, parts of what's now the American Southwest, South, and Southeast, also to the islands in the Caribbean. Now, this tobacco wasn't used recreationally. It was only used in rituals and ceremonies where only some members of the tribe smoked. And wild tobacco? Well, there are several varieties of wild tobacco throughout the continent. In our area of the Sierra foothills, coyote tobacco is probably the most prevalent. But did the Indians living in the west half of the North American continent have a prehistoric, pre-contact tradition of using tobacco? If you'd asked me that question 20 years ago, I would have said no. It was in the 1700s when Hudson's Bay Company men traveling around the Horn brought with them tobacco that they traded with the Indians on the west coast. And then, of course, that through trade, that tobacco found its way eastward until the western half of the continent had an established tradition of using tobacco. But there's been some archaeological sites recently that have challenged that. 2 in the American Plateau, 2 in Washington State, 2 in California, and 1 in Alaska. At those sites, clay and stone pipes have been discovered. Now, Indians smoked a variety of plants. This was done for rituals, part of a ceremony, even as a medicine. But biomolecular archaeologists, it's a tough one to get out, have been studying these pipes, and they found trace amounts of nicotine linked to wild tobacco. So, did Ishii's people, the Yagi, have a pre-contact tobacco culture? We don't know. Outside of clay and stone pipes, archaeological evidence for tobacco use doesn't survive deposition. And by the time ethnographers descended on tribes in the 19th century to learn their life ways, most had a cultural tradition that included using domesticated tobacco. However, according to a Tahoe National Forest ethnography, the Maidu actually had a wild tobacco culture. In fact, it was a plant they both cultivated and managed. I hope that answers your question, Jim. Thank you for asking.